So why do first impressions hold so much sway over how others read us?
This is a fascinating question when you start to unpack it.
So for those of you who don't know Caryn, would you mind please sharing a little bit about yourself and your background and your work experience?
Sure. So I've worked in and around fashion for 42 years. I started off in magazines, moved from fashion editor to co-editor of ID magazine. And as a journalist, I then moved into broadcast. So I spent 12 years with the BBC on their primetime show, The Clothes Show, which had an audience of 13 million every week. I call myself a fashion and identity commentator. 10 years ago, I took a Master of Science in Psychology because I just wanted to look at things in a bit more depth.
So Caryn, we were chatting and you mentioned that clothes are a superpower. I was wondering if you could explain to us why you think that.
Clothes are a superpower because they do two amazing things. They affect our own sense of self-efficacy and how we perceive ourselves. And they also affect the opinions that others have of us in the way that that first impression is that first moment where we take everything in about that person. To give a good example of something like that, I'd use uniforms, for instance. So the uniform affects the wearer's sense of how they're going to behave, reminds them of their position and the knowledge that they carry with them with that uniform and how they'll interact. But it also signals to the person who sees them, oh, okay, this is someone who's going to perform this service and going to behave in this kind of way. And I'd say that actually all clothes can be distilled into that, because when we wear formal clothes, we're kind of saying this is the occasion that requires a bit of sobriety and I will be behaving in a certain way. But then we might choose, for some downtime, we might choose something that says, I'm off the clock, I'm up for some spontaneity and some fun. So all of those things are put into even subtle choices, because we see lots of small touches on clothing that help us understand the wearer's intentions.
You know, something that comes to mind as you're talking about that is prior to menswear and fashion, I used to be a lawyer, and the idea of a uniform, I mean, lawyers are always in suits, and there's a good reason for that, especially if you're a trial attorney. You want to make a certain impression, and oftentimes, you want to be seen as an authority, you want to be seen as, in a position of power, so you're going to wear, certain clothing, and trial attorneys will instruct their clients to also dress a particular way, because depending on, maybe what the case is about, you want your client, to come off as weak, potentially, or maybe strong or innocent, and all that can be affected by your choice of clothing. And something else that came to mind, which is intrinsically more British than American, is the idea of school uniforms.
Well, I think when you've got a uniform that everyone agrees to wear exactly the same, that's as much about a sense of belonging and about pack mentality. So as a group, we are often given codes for behaviour, so everybody perhaps understands that when they're in school uniform and they're in the building, that they can't be spontaneous and lark about. The uniform says you're here to focus, you're here to concentrate. And I think ultimately, without us really understanding, every item of clothing that we put on does that. And we are making, even if we think we're not making choices, we are making choices every time we put a garment on our body and we match it with something, we coordinate it. We make choices about proportions in relation to our body, in relation to what we want to achieve. Because most people have a sense of what suits them and maybe what to avoid. I think we all work with uniforms of one kind or another, and they can actually provide security so that we know what we're going to put on and we don't have our mental resources taken up with, what goes with what, and So, we know kind of high profile, extremely proficient people have chosen to wear the same thing. The Steve Jobs polo neck. Barack Obama famously had one style of suit that he put on every day because he didn't want to think about, what should I wear instead, or I wore that yesterday. We actually do compartmentalise our looks and our lives into uniforms. We've got our leisure wear look. You know, we've got our formal look, we've got our jazz it up in the evening look with a flourish. We've got, you know, we've got what we like to wear with our jeans. We've got sort of set go-to uniforms because it provides certainty and familiarity, and the brain loves certainty because then it's entered into a phase of what's called cognitive ease. Whereas cognitive loading is where perhaps you're trying something, you're not sure if it's right, you're constantly checking your appearance, you're looking in shop windows, should I have worn these socks with that trouser? And so these are important mental resources that are taken up with your clothes making a very loud noise in your head. So we're all aiming for stepping into our clothes confidently, knowing that they fit us and suit us, and they telegraph the messages that we want to telegraph.
I mean, this is where I think it's extremely unfair that men have a huge advantage over women, because we have a pretty strict uniform. For most occasions,
Yes.
it can be a pair of trousers, a sport coat, and a shirt, and then you can just sort of play around with, you know, the colors or the patterns, or, you know, swap out your ties or pocket squares.
I think men are entering into a stage where they're starting to be just a little bit more experimental because men's catwalk looks are so much more avant-garde. But I agree with you on the whole, and I think that's a comforting thing for men dressing, is that there are kind of set looks that become those reliable uniforms that then inform the way we feel and behave for the rest of the day.
It's funny because even though there's this box sort of that men are in, there's still so much that can go wrong. Like, I think a lot of guys think that just because they put on a suit, they can check that box. You know, I now look professional just because I'm wearing a suit. When the suit is maybe so ill-fitting, it's actually doing them a huge disservice, and they're not projecting, you know, that first impression that they think they are.
Really good point. Actually, fit is key, and there have been studies done where they've had participants look at two different photos, and where the suit has been well fitted, they gave that person, they awarded them character traits of trustworthiness, of honesty and of motivation. Whereas when that person was wearing an ill-fitted suit, it obviously factored into our sense of this person's ability to make the right decisions and to be someone, could you really trust them to get it right? They can't get themselves dressed in the morning. You know, it really is as literal as that.
So why do first impressions hold so much sway over how others read us?
This is a fascinating question when you start to unpack it. First of all, we need to look at the brain and the way in which the brain absorbs information. So we see, the brain sees in under 1/10 of a second. And it's able to make decisions based on having seen something for a very short period of time. There was a study done where people were literally shown this 1/10 of a second expression, and they were quite nuanced expressions of people, but they were able to decide on the emotion that person was feeling based on this tiny piece of information. And that's because the brain is reaching back to retrieve all of the information it already has about that situation. So what we know about a crumpled shirt as opposed to an ironed shirt, that's all back in there. What we know about a body that's slouching, what we know about the way that something's been put together and coordinated. So when we meet someone for the first time, we're often kind of hyper-vigilant. We're paying a little bit of extra attention. If you're anything like me, you're trying to remember their name. You've been told it and you're repeating it in your head. But you're focused on this first kind of moment, and also that person's charisma, you know, the energy they bring in the room. So you're really absorbing everything. So the brain is in a heightened state. This big blast of information goes in, and if you happen to have met someone, maybe they're a bit poorly on that day, dressed in loose clothing, perhaps their voice isn't projecting in the way that they would, that kind of tends to be, oh, that's how I know that person. And that's why when we're going for an interview, we want to pay full attention to absolutely every signal we're giving off.
That's a lot of pressure on all of us.
For the most part, the brain learns through repetition. So knowledge becomes embedded because we do something over and over again, we hear it over and over again, we see it over and over again. And so in terms of our own grooming, in terms of our own understanding what suits our body, we're fairly constant. So that repetition of knowing I reach for this because it works for me, you know, I like this grooming, I like this fragrance, I enjoy meeting people, so you know I like to shake their hand firmly. All of those things become intrinsically embedded into our character. And we can work on our character. We can decide that we are going to be perhaps more open-hearted, perhaps more compassionate, or perhaps more approachable. Often business leaders, power allows them to feel that they are superior to other people in the room. And that's certainly one of the things that we're learning, that kind of approach doesn't make for good leadership. So business leaders are having to perhaps unclench and be more human and be more open. And we certainly respond. Look at how social media now allows us to see people who've been in front of our screens previously in perfected situations, and then they show us themselves at home in their kind of weekend clothes, you know, burping the baby or something. People love that because they love to see...
So authenticity.
Yes.
Yeah.
We are a culture that really values the business of appearance in a way that many other cultures can't afford to, because it's much lower down their list of priorities. You know, there's Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where at the bottom are the basics, you know, air, food, water, next level shelter, next level relationships and fitting into groups, next level self-esteem and sense of self, and finally self-actualization. And actually that space is where we have the confidence to be authentic and to be who we are and to be altruistic, to look outwards. And so people, you know, one could look at fashion and say, is that you wanting to make the visual embodiment of self-actualization? Is that a sort of motif for my life is organised, I'm happy with who I am, I'm confident in my choices? I think at heart we're all very vulnerable, and all clothes are either comfort blankets or armour at their most basic.
And I think, like, I feel like I've sort of reached enlightenment in my, you know, my fashion and my sense of style lately, because I've started now to dress purely for myself. I used to dress the way that I wanted others to perceive me, and then I don't know if it was just time in the industry or knowledge, but I've started to dress how I want to see myself. And there's a certain sense of like power and freedom that comes with the space to do that, and like the feeling of creativity to do that. And I think that's, you know, that's sort of when you reach the next level, and you feel that you can.
Well, you talked earlier about enjoyment, and ultimately, you know, we live in a privileged society and we engage with clothes as a kind of pleasure of what do I need to wear today that's going to help me to be my best self and going to help other people to perceive me as an open-hearted, approachable person. Maybe create a few talking points when I'm in a room and I can perhaps compliment someone on their choice and start a conversation.
So Caryn, there's a saying that I think most of us are familiar with: do clothes maketh the man. What do you think?
So I definitely think that they do. And what actually we're feeding into there is a psychological concept called essentialism, which is we imbue objects with a certain kind of personality or certain characteristics. And so we imbue that in a suit or garments that can actually help us to step into it and to project a sense of an idealized self, a perfected self, essentially our best self. who we want to be. I've got a lovely little story from my husband, who's lucky enough to have a few made-to-measure suits, and he says when he wears those, he's very aware of slowing down, of being more patient, of being more polite, and generally of performing for the suit as an elegant human being, which I really love, that a garment can do that for you.
So Caryn, what would be your overall tips for making a great first impression?
You know what you're going to wear, you've paid attention to the detail, everything's crisp and ready to go, your shoes are shining, and when you step into it, you're perfecting your idealized self, you're ready to meet the world. It makes you stand taller. Think about how you are using your body, how you're moving. And one that everybody in the media uses and is very effective is the big smile. The science behind it is that you create a feedback loop for your own brain to experience yourself with your mood lifted and happy feelings. And when we smile, our smiles are infectious, and so people can't help smiling back at us. So in situations where you want to give your best self, stepping in with attention to your appearance and the big open-hearted smile is all you need.
Well, we hope that you learned something in this video. If you have any questions or comments, please leave them below, and don't forget to subscribe.